Hi, and welcome to the webinar, Protecting Your Real Estate Investments, Why Insurance Might Be Your Best Friend. I am attorney Sarah Holmes, and I will be your presenter today. All right, so let's lead with a little bit of background information. Who am I? What's my background? Why am I telling you these things? And what are you going to find out about today? So myself, I've been an attorney in Pennsylvania and New Jersey for almost 10 years. I started my career doing personal injury litigation, mostly for the bulk of that time on the defense side, meaning I defended landlords, property owners, and big box stores from personal injury claims. So I often went to court in Philadelphia on behalf of my clients. In addition, I sit as a certified arbitrator probably 4 or 5 times a year in the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas and help decide personal injury cases that have a claimed value under $50,000. And about, 6 years ago, I started my first business in my kitchen. It was a product manufacturing business. I eventually grew it to, I had products in about almost 100 stores across the country. And what I learned was I started meeting so many other entrepreneurs out there just like myself. I did a number of trade shows. I just loved being around business owners and other people that really had an entrepreneurial spirit about them. So I decided that if the day came when I left my law firm doing personal injury work, I would open a law practice dedicated to helping only entrepreneurs and business owners, kind of similar to myself. So I was lucky enough that about 3 years ago, I did get that opportunity and I did open my own law practice. So now I counsel small to mid-sized businesses on anything from startup and incorporation to partnership disputes, trademark registration, and commercial leasing. So also within the past year, I have gotten a number of real estate investor clients, and not because I'm a real estate lawyer, because I'm not. I don't do closings and some of the stuff we're going to talk about today, like title work. I generally don't do that type of thing. But what I do is because I've seen what can happen in a personal injury suit, and property owners used to be my clients, I'm able to counsel real estate investors as to their risk and what is the best way to protect themselves from liability. What are the tools and the resources that we can use to give them the best shot at protecting both their personal and their business assets. So we usually employ a number of strategies ranging from selecting a business entity, whether it's an LLC or something else, to using different kinds of insurance, to using contracts. How do we shift liability within a contract to someone else? And we sit down and come up with a whole comprehensive strategy into how these investors can protect themselves. And it's been a really, really great program for my clients. And I've broken up some of this information into several different presentations, so people can get a sense of the underlying information. In addition, I recently launched a book on Amazon.com about using LLCs for real estate investing and why you don't want to get sued. So if you happen to have a minute and want to check out the title there, you should be able to get a copy on that as well. But today we're going to focus mostly on the second way of protecting yourself from the risk when you own property, which is by using insurance. So when we look at what are the biggest risks when you purchase and own property, there's usually 3 main areas where risk comes from. One is a risk that the property you owned has something wrong with the deed or the title, and you don't actually own the property, or there's some type of challenge to your ownership of the property. That's a huge risk. Second is that the property suffers some kind of damage. Maybe it's a flood, maybe it's a storm. Now all of a sudden you have this property that you have to sink tens of thousands of dollars into. Well, anybody running a business knows that at any one time, keeping that amount of cash on hand can be difficult. You're constantly using that money, putting it back into the business, investing in other things. So how do you best guard against property damage claims, or in the event you're unfortunate enough to have one, what can you do about it to make it less financially painful for yourself? And three, my biggest one I cancel people on, and my favorite is someone gets injured on your property and you get sued. So liability, how do you best protect yourself from liability using insurance? And what's the best way to make sure you get the best outcome in the event that you do get sued? All right, so at the end of the presentation today, you should have a clear idea of these three areas of risk and maybe what are some ways to look at your insurance policies to make sure that you really have adequate coverage in place. You should be able to take a better look at them and kind of figure out what works for you, or maybe you've never even bothered to look at your policies. Maybe you don't even know what kind of coverage you have in place. So at the end of this webinar, the goal is that you will be able to ask intelligent questions of either your insurance agent or attorney as to what coverage you have and what coverage you should have. And you should be able to at least pull out a deck page from one of your policies and read it properly and figure out, what kind of coverage actually you have right now today. So let's talk about the number one risk, and not the number one in terms of happens most often, but just in sequential order that we're talking about for the webinar today, which is a defective title. So what does that mean? Well, this could be a number of things, but it means that there's something wrong in the chain of deeds leading up to your property. So most property has been owned by someone else in the past, most likely a good number of someone's in the past. And property ownership is always conveyed by a deed. And it really matters a lot what kind of language is in the deed and how it's recorded, whether it was recorded, because that could potentially affect ownership claims later down the line in terms of who owns this property. So what are some problems with a title? Could be that there's an unrecorded deed out there. Someone's got a deed sitting in a drawer that for some godforsaken reason they didn't ever bother recording. It happens probably more than you even know. Maybe there's a mortgage out there that was never recorded. Maybe there's a claim, a lien. It could be, I don't know, a judgment. Maybe there's some unknown heirs to a property that was owned by someone that has passed on and it never went to probate. Maybe there are some issues of fraud in the past. Maybe a deed was forged. In fact, in Philadelphia, not that long ago, there were huge scandals about deeds being forged. Basically, people stealing properties. They would forge deeds, forge signatures, and they would go file them in the recorder's office. And suddenly the owner, had no idea they were no longer the legal owner of the property. So the recorder's office put some more controls into place, security controls in terms of filing a deed and providing the right documents. But still, you don't know when someone's going to make a claim like that. So when you buy a property, the seller is conveying to you that they have good and marketable title, and you don't really want anyone else coming along and making ownership claims to the property. So who typically does a search for the deeds and the title? Well, that's what a title company does. They typically will go and look through the chain of titles and determine, hey, this is a flag or this is okay, and then decide whether or not to insure the title. So particularly if you buy any kind of a property that is distressed, like maybe it was from a sheriff's sale, maybe it's a foreclosure, maybe the property has an easement on it or some kind of a strange right-of-way going through it. In any of those situations, a title search is really even more important than just your standard vanilla property purchase. Because before you buy it, you really need to know what kind of liens there might be and if you have to satisfy them upon purchasing the property. You certainly don't want to get to closing and find out that you owe, $50,000 in back taxes or whatever it is. So a title company, where are they going to do searches? They're going to look at the Recorder of Deeds office. They might pull court filings. Maybe they'll go to orphans court, see if there's any family issues. Register of wills, see if there was probate. And then what if there is a title problem? Well, then you could hire an attorney, not me, a real estate attorney, and file an action to quiet title. This will be a court declaration that you own the property and any other interests out there are extinguished. So sometimes that might be necessary and it's a good thing to do, but it can cost you several $1,000s. So again, if there is in fact a title problem, you want to know about it up front before you are taking on even more costs with things like, questionable, sketchy titles. Okay, what are some things that would not be covered by title insurance, or that they wouldn't necessarily be um, falling under a title insurance policy? Anything like a boundary dispute, for example. Maybe you didn't have a survey done, and 3 years later, your neighbor comes over and says, "Hey, you built your fence 3 feet onto my property. You need to take it off, and pay me damages." Maybe there's mechanics liens on the property. The prior homeowner had a bunch of construction work done, didn't bother paying the contractors. That's a problem. Utilities might have a lien if they remain unpaid. Generally, that type of stuff would not be covered by title insurance. So again, you kind of want to do your own due diligence when purchasing a property to make sure that you are clear what kinds of issues out there and what has actually been cleared up and looks good to go. All right, so basically, what kinds of insurance do you need? So we're going to talk about a number of things today in terms of what sort of insurance you need when buying property, but let's go through. First, there's a difference between owner-occupied property versus landlord property. There's property damage insurance, there's flood insurance, there's loss of rental income insurance, there's liability insurance, and then there's umbrella insurance. So let's back up a bit and just talk about, in general, what kind of insurance do you need? Well, this depends largely on what kind of a property you have. So what happens a lot of times is that people become unintentional real estate investors. What do I mean by that? I mean that someone bought a house, usually in like 2006, 2007, 2008, the height of the market, right before the big collapse. And, it's 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, they want to now move out of that property and they can't sell it because they're so far underwater on the property. In the meantime, they have to move, they move out, and now they find themselves needing to rent this former property out. So they have kind of become accidental property investors and accidental landlords. So often what people do is they just figure, hey, I have homeowners coverage. Let's get some tenants in here. We'll move out. Everything will be good to go. Well, you think that if there's a problem, you're just going to call your homeowners company, homeowners insurance, and they're going to cover the claim. Well, if your homeowners insurance finds out that you've been renting the property and it's no longer owner occupied, and you never bothered telling them that you changed it, your claim could very well be denied. And that could be a huge problem, especially if it's a liability claim, worth a lot of money. So in that event, what kind of insurance do you get? Well, there's insurance policies that are very specific to landlords. The insurance company knows your landlord, and they write the risk based on the fact that you are renting the property to tenants. So there's a wide number of options in terms of landlord policies, and you have to carefully read your policies and your deck pages to determine what's coverage, because not all things are covered in a policy, and the insurance companies, they love to find reasons to disclaim coverage, meaning they love to find a reason why your claim doesn't fall under the risks in the policy and not have to pay the claim. So, if you think about it, why do public adjusters exist? They exist because insurance companies give people a hard time sometimes in paying claims. I don't know if you've ever had to make a property damage claim yourself with your property. Sometimes you really have to fight the insurance company to get the claim approved. It's a constant back and forth, like, well, was it wind? Was it rain? Was it hail? And some of those things might be covered under your policy and other of those things might not. And it may make no sense or rhyme or reason to you. But the fact is that most people wait until it's too late, meaning they already have a claim, and then they are scrambling and pulling out their policy and trying to figure out what does and doesn't fall under their coverage. So that's not what you want to do. You want to be very clear up front as to what is covered under your policy. So one type of coverage that you certainly want included in your landlord policy is property damage claims. So this would cover things like fire, storm damage, ice, wind, hail, And you want to make sure that it covers the actual risks that are likely to occur where your property is. So again, make sure you're clear which ones it covers and does not cover, because you might be surprised to find out that maybe your policy covers fire and wind, but it doesn't cover hail. That's not unheard of. It sounds like a joke, but it really isn't. So be very, very clear with your insurance broker and the company as to what exactly is covered. So if you have a property that is, for example, damaged in a storm, it can cost you thousands and thousands of dollars to make repairs. If you own a number of properties, you might not always have the cash on hand to make huge repairs. And that becomes more of an issue the more properties you have, because at any given time, it may in fact be that you have multiple problems going on that are eating into your cash reserves. So what you don't want to be doing is borrowing against any of the equity you have in your rental properties to make these repairs. So that's why having a good property damage insurance policy is really important. It could also cover things like theft and potentially tenant damage. So again, depending on what kind of tenants you rent to, maybe what part of town the property's in, is it college kids? Are they going crazy? Any kind of damage, you don't want to be stocking, $20,000 to $30,000 in repairs every time someone moves out of your property. So make sure you have some good property damage coverage in place. All right, and then there's a phrase called guaranteed replacement cost. And this is something you definitely want to try to have in your policy, although it becomes more and more difficult to find, and it potentially could be a lot more expensive. But what that means is that if the property is blown up, or somehow destroyed, you need to be able to rebuild that property, even if the building costs have gone up and it's going to cost a lot more than what the house was even worth to replace it, which isn't unheard of. It's not unusual. Maybe, especially if the property is in a not very nice part of town, say the property is worth $50,000, the house burns to the ground. Well, how are you going to build a house in 2016 for $50,000? What are they going to make it with? Like marshmallows? I mean, there's not a lot of building materials you can find, let alone the labor cost. That's only going to be $50,000. So chances are rebuilding the house is going to cost a lot more than it was even worth at fair market value. So that's why this guaranteed replacement cost might cost you a bit more money, but it's going to be worth it if something catastrophic really does happen and you wouldn't have rebuilt the house normally. All right, what about something like flood insurance? Well, you really have to look at where is the property located. Is it in a location that's likely to flood? Because if it is, or even if you're in an area with very poor water runoff, or maybe every time it rains hard, the sewers get blocked up, that could be a location where maybe it's not officially on a floodplain, but maybe it's, there's enough water problems. Maybe you don't have a sump pump in the basement, and you want to look at some kind of flood coverage, because flood coverage is never going to be covered under your regular property damage policy. It has to be a separate policy. So, it could be some extra money, but if it happens, you're going to be really glad you have it. So definitely something to look into. All right, what is a loss of rental income policy? So for example, if there's some kind of like natural event that makes your property uninhabitable and you lose rental income, you can make a claim and recover the rent that you would have made. So it's not going to cover things like evictions. If you have tenants that are deadbeats and you need to evict them, it's only going to cover if the property is damaged by some natural event or your normal run-of-the-mill damage claim. So you want to make sure that before considering this kind of policy, you really look at what the premiums are going to run you to see if that is in fact more than the cash reserves you have on hand. So if you can live a couple months without your rental income, this might not be coverage that you want to have in place. On the other hand, if you tend to not have a lot of cash reserves, maybe you run your business a little more lean, you know, maybe then this kind of coverage is really important to you because losing 3, 4, 5 months of rental income could really sink you. And especially if you have a large mortgage on a property, that really might be something that you take into consideration. So I'll tell you a quick personal story about this kind of coverage or how this would apply. So when I was about 23 years old, I rented a townhouse in Chicago. So I was moving out of another apartment, and I had already told my landlord from the first apartment that I was moving, and they'd already rented my place to someone else. So about a week before I was scheduled to move into my new place, there's a big fire at the house next door, and the wind picked up and blew the fire over to the property that I had rented. The property I had rented suffered a lot of smoke and fire damage, and it was not ready for me to move into. So in the meantime, I had nowhere to live. So I moved back in with my parents in another state, and I had to commute 90 minutes to work every day. So my landlord kept telling me that the insurance company is handling the claim, the work will be done. I think the first estimate was like the work's going to be done in 3 weeks. It seemed kind of incredible that it would be done in 3 weeks, but 3 weeks was what they kept telling him. So I waited and I didn't bother looking for another apartment for a little while, but finally 6 weeks went by. There was no progress. So I decided to start going out and looking for other apartments. So I was out one night looking at other places, and I was in a car accident. I had like a head injury. I had hit stitches in my head, a concussion. So at that point, I stopped looking for another apartment to move into, and I just decided to suck it up and wait until these repairs were done. So finally, in the end, I think it ended up taking about 12 weeks for all of this work to be done, which is 4 times the length of time the insurance company originally told us it was going to take. So that's kind of something that happens. You know, if you've ever had work done, which I'm sure being in this line of business you have, you know that anytime a contractor is involved, there's permits, you know, you always have to be at least doubling the timeline that they give you, just because things come up, you know, they have other jobs, the weather's bad, whatever, you know, the issue is, the time ends up being a lot more than originally predicted. So, for example, if my landlord then was out 3 months of rent because I couldn't live there, you know, if he had loss of income coverage, he could have recovered the 3 months I would have paid him in rent. Um, so, you know, it's definitely a type of coverage to consider, but again, you have to weigh the cost of it versus how much you keep cash reserves on hand. And if you could float, you know, I'd say 6 months or less with the cash you keep on hand, or whether the premium on this type of coverage is low enough to make it worthwhile to invest in it. Okay, so liability insurance. This is like the biggest coverage that you really need to have in place. And what does liability coverage entail? What does that even cover? Well, that's if someone's injured on the property, you're going to get sued. And it's not even just your tenants being injured on the property, but it could be a guest of your tenants. It could be someone walking by the property and slipping and falling on ice, tripping and falling on the sidewalk outside the house. Always, whenever there's a personal injury claim, the plaintiff's lawyers want to look for property owners with insurance. And don't ever think that your neighbor's property doesn't impact your own. And what do I mean by that? Well, here's kind of a tip. Here's a big secret. Personal injury lawyers don't sue people that don't have insurance. And why do they not sue people that don't have insurance? Because most of the time they take cases on a contingency fee basis until the case is settled or it goes to a verdict at an arbitration or in court. So once the case is finally done, then the lawyer gets 30% of whatever the recovery is. But how is a lawyer going to best guarantee that, you know, 2 or 3 years later when that case is resolved, that they're going to get paid? Well, the guarantee is insurance. They only sue people with insurance policies because otherwise they're wasting their time. They could go 2 to 3 years working on a case and not getting paid. And at the very end, if the person doesn't have an insurance policy, you know, what's the likelihood that any one individual person has the means to pay off a judgment, or how much more money does the lawyer have to spend executing on the judgment, meaning finding the person's assets, finding their bank accounts, forcing them to sell off things. It's generally not worth it. So they 9 times out of 10, they only sue people with insurance policies in place. So how does it actually play out in the real world if you're in court and you're involved in a lawsuit? Well, one of the first cases I ever defended involved a landlord. My client was a landlord, and he owned a pretty nice property that he rented to tenants. And it was your typical Philadelphia row home. It's attached to both sides, but it shared a staircase in the front with the house next door. And the house next door, the property was vacant. It was in pretty bad shape. And as far as like the common staircase went, the neighbor's stairs were all chipped and cracked up, whereas my client kept his very nicely maintained. He re-poured the concrete every once in a while. But one night, his tenant had a guest over, and she tripped and fell on a crack on the stairs. She had some kind of like soft tissue injury. So when I took her deposition, well, she sued. So first of all, she sues my client, and she sued the neighbor, because at that point, they don't really know where the property line is. It happens to be right in the middle of the stairs. So they sued both of them. And the neighbor, it turns out, doesn't have insurance. So the neighbor never shows up to court, never appears in the case. Who knows? They could be alive, they could be dead. Nobody even knows where this neighbor is. So it's basically my client is the one stuck in the case. So I take this plaintiff's deposition and I show her a photo of the stairs, and I ask her what part of the stairs caused her to fall. So she sees the neighbor's cracked up side of the stairs, and she circles an area on the neighbor's side, clearly, that she thinks is defective. So I'm thinking to myself, this is great. I'm going to file a motion. I'll get my client out of this case. Well, that's just not how things work in Philadelphia. Very few motions are granted that will get you out of a case before it goes to a trial. The truth is that once you're actually in a lawsuit, meaning you've been named as a defendant, it can be very difficult to get yourself out. So, the motion's denied and we go on to arbitration. So at least I'm thinking at the arbitration, well, if she changes her story today, I can just take out her prior deposition and impeach her and make the arbitrators question her credibility. So we go to arbitration, and I ask her this time, what caused you to fall? And now she circles an area that clearly straddles the property line. So it seems obvious to me that her attorney has somehow coached her now that the neighbor doesn't have insurance and he can't be their target because they'll never get paid. So the arbitrators, another way that this really works in real life is an arbitrator's job is to keep cases off a judge's docket, meaning that if the case really should have settled, there was any kind of close call, the arbitrator should give out some kind of award that may end up enticing the parties to settle the case and not having either side appeal and make it go further and go in front of a judge. So even though I did a great job, I thought, impeaching this woman, questioning her credibility, well, why are you saying, it's in the middle of the line now, at your deposition 6 months ago, it's clearly on the neighbor's side. She has some excuse for that. Oh, I don't know, or I wasn't sure. Well, the arbitrators, again, they look at part of their job is to keep the judge's dockets clear, so they give her some money for the injury. Eventually, we just settled the case for slightly less than the award rather than appealing it and going through an entire trial. But this just goes to show you a number of things. So number one is that your neighbor's property does make a difference. You might think, hey, I don't care what the property next door looks like. This is an investment property for me. My tenants will move in. Who cares? Who cares about the neighbors next door? Well, you should care because it makes a great deal of difference if they're doing the proper things, like having insurance. Because if somebody comes along, say there's a fire, who are they going to be looking to sue? Well, they're not looking to sue the guy with no insurance. They're going to be looking to sue the person that can satisfy some kind of verdict or claim. Two, it shows you that it's very difficult to get out of a lawsuit once you're in one. So the best way to make sure that you are not involved in a lawsuit is to have, real practices and policies in place um, to prevent yourself from being sued in the first place. And number three, the moral of this story is that at least my client did, in fact, have liability insurance, which not only paid for the judgment, but it also paid my fees. So if you get sued for personal injuries, your liability coverage will provide you with a defense to the lawsuit and pay your attorney's fees. This part alone can save you tens of thousands of dollars. So a typical, I would say, lower level slip and fall case that's worth under $50,000 and goes before arbitration in Philly, typically you're looking at about $20,000 in attorney's fees. If that case gets appealed and then goes to a full-blown trial later, now you're looking at attorney's fees of $35,000 to $40,000 if you pay an attorney hourly. So how much money does that save you if you have the proper liability insurance in place? A lot. It could save you a whole lot of money. And most of the time, you'll very minimally have to deal with the lawsuit. The insurance company's attorneys will handle most of it for you. You will have to cooperate and, attend depositions and court appearances. But basically, they'll try to make it as easy as they can on you. All right, so next, let's look at how much coverage you should have in place. This is always a big question. So I often do an analysis with my investor clients. And what we do is we have to look at what kind of property they have, where it's located, what kind of tenants are they putting in the property, how many of them live there. And we really sit down and kind of draw an overall map to really understand, okay, if you're running everything out of the same LLC, what's your exposure? If you only have, one umbrella, how does that work? What's the primary coverage on each property? And we sit there and we really map it out. So not to be totally insensitive, but different people's injuries are worth different amounts of money depending on who they are. So let's think about, ask some questions here. What is an injury worth? For example, let's ask the question, what do you think a broken leg injury would be worth? So let's say it's a bad break. It requires surgery and some subsequent physical therapy. What do you think a claim like that is worth? And maybe just think about it for a second. Okay, now let's change the facts a bit. So what if that person, the plaintiff with the broken leg, is a college athlete that really depended on his ability to play a sport in order to pay his college tuition? Now, how much do you think that claim is worth? Probably a lot more, right? Okay. What if it's in fact a 70-year-old woman, but say she was totally independent and now she has to hire a home health aide to help her with basic things around the house? Is that claim worth more now? The answer is yes. So all of these are different factors that really can affect the value of a case. If you ask me in Philadelphia what a typical broken leg with surgery and subsequent physical therapy is worth, I would say that's a low six-figure case. It's definitely over 100. Is it more than 200? Depends. Depends what some of these factors are. But it's definitely between $100,000 and $200,000. It also depends on how each person recovers. What's this plaintiff's story and how well did he or she recover? So sometimes you have plaintiffs, even the ones that are very motivated to heal and get better, sometimes they have residual problems that last for years. One common thing you hear all the time is, when it rains, I have more pain, or, when it rains, this injury starts to flare up again. And I think it's something with, the atmospheric pressure, but it's a real complaint that almost every plaintiff I've ever had come before me says the same thing, and they're not all making it up. I think that for them, it's really true, but these are the things that tend to drive up the value of a case. A very credible plaintiff with a good story, a good sob story, could definitely drive those numbers north. So in the broken leg example, you have a really good plaintiff, makes a nice presentation in front of a jury, seems very credible. is trying their best to get better and go to therapy, but they just have these ongoing problems. If they're sincere and come off as good people, the jury's going to give them more money. And that's just how that works. The more likable your plaintiff is, the more it is that the jury is going to give them more money. So that's why it's really important to take a look at who are the people in your property. Not only who are they, but what kinds of people are they likely to have coming over to visit? And again, in the worst case scenario, what is a really terrible injury worth? So again, before I moved to Philadelphia, I lived in Chicago. And right before I left, there was a huge porch collapse case. So if you're familiar with the housing stock in Chicago, typically there we had what were called flats, which was most of them about 3-4 stories, one apartment stacked on one another, vertically going up. And out back, there's always a back door that is like your fire exit. And normally there's some kind of porch or deck out there with like a long set of wooden steps that lead to the ground floor in case there's a fire and you need to exit the property. But, the decks aren't just meant as fire egress. They're also, places to entertain, to have people outside. And right before I moved here, there was a big case involving a deck where there were a large number of recent college graduates out back on the deck. I think they're all from Northwestern. They're having a party, and the deck collapsed. And this was a really bad case. Several of them were killed. A large number were seriously injured. So now you have a number of dead, Ivy educated college kids in their early 20s. What do you think those claims are worth? I can tell you they're worth a whole lot, because these are kids that had huge working lives ahead of them. Their projected lifetime loss of income was just going to be huge. Big, big claims. So if you have a terrible situation like that, and you have a $300,000 liability policy on the property, that is not going to go very far in terms of covering even one of these claims. So, if you have a terrible situation like that and you are underinsured, what happens? So what happens then is the lawyers start looking at the property owner named on the deed. They want to see if that property owner has any assets that can make up the difference between whatever the judgment was and whatever the policy limits are. So for example, if it's your own name on the deed, they're going to find out what assets you have personally and see if there's anything they can force you to sell off to satisfy this claim. Or, do you have wage income somewhere? Can they garnish your wages? Do you own 8 other rental properties in your name? Okay, well, if we get you to sell off all 8 of them, are we getting closer to, the number we need to satisfy this liability claim? If it's an LLC on the deed, they're going to look to see if the LLC has any assets. And most of the time, if you have set up your risk strategies properly, the only asset that LLC should have in it is, in fact, that property. And even if you own 10 other properties, they should not be in that same LLC, so that, you are, in fact, minimizing your risks if there is a huge verdict or judgment because of these personal injury claims. So the lesson with liability coverage is that this is just not an area where you can really skimp on coverage or cheap out. It's just not a good idea, and it could really come back to bite you in the event that there is something bad that happens. All right, so let's look at should you get an umbrella policy? Okay, so here's kind of where now when I sit with my clients, we map out this strategy. Where would an umbrella policy pick up? Well, that's if you have this excess claim above your primary policy limits. So let's go back to the unfortunate case of the dead college kids. All right, you have a property, you have a $300,000 limit, and now you have a dead college kid. So let's say you have one, there's a $3 million judgment. So, if you only have $300,000 in coverage, where's the rest of that money coming from? Well, now let's say that you have an umbrella policy in place. So the 300,000 gets eaten up pretty much immediately. Now, where is that money coming from? Okay, so if your umbrella policy now is 2 million, well, now we're getting a little closer to that $3 million judgment. Now someone's got 2.3 million. Maybe now they'll leave you alone. Maybe they're still gonna sniff around and see if there's an extra 700,000 they can get somewhere. But the point is that now your shot of escaping, them looking for any more assets becomes less and less likely because you have this umbrella that they can access. Lawyers love umbrella policies because it means they know that they can max out the primary coverage and that there's something else beyond that that they can get to. So an umbrella policy, a commercial policy tends to be more expensive, but if your properties are in an LLC, you have to have a commercial umbrella. You might consider still getting a personal umbrella because they're relatively expensive, inexpensive. And if in fact you're putting yourself out there, you are gathering up some assets, the more successful you get, the more you kind of start putting a target on your back. So it might be good to have a personal umbrella in any event. So, in the event you're sued, there's some catastrophic injury, first thing is the primary insurance. What's the limit? What's the payout? Beyond that, if there's more money, do you want them looking to either your personal assets or your LLC's assets? If the answer is no, then maybe you should get the umbrella in place because now the umbrella is going to provide you maybe with $1 to $5 million more in coverage. And for most situations, most circumstances, that's hopefully all the coverage you ever need. But again, this is not, there are no blanket recommendations for this kind of stuff. You really should do a proper analysis of what kind of property is it, who do you have living in it, and what are the kinds of risks that you're really concerned about. And make sure that those policies are really crafted and thought about for your own particular situation, not just simply a blanket statement, have $1 million in coverage and get a 2 million umbrella. Because while that might sound like plenty of money for a single family home that you just typically rent to, 2 people or, maybe 2 older people. Now, if you're talking about maybe a 4 flat or a 5 flat with, 3 to 4 people living in each unit, that money is actually not going to go too far in the case of a catastrophic event or catastrophic injuries. So that's why you really have to look at the comprehensive, holistic picture. Okay, so what other kinds of insurance should you be thinking about? Well, a big one is renter's insurance. If you have tenants in your properties, do you make them get renter's insurance? And not only renter's insurance, because that will cover damage to any of their own belongings, but do you make them get their own liability policy? So especially if you let tenants have pets or dogs and that dog bites someone, don't think that just because it's not your dog and you're just the landlord that you're not going to get sued. That's not true. You probably will get sued because, again, they're looking for the insurance and money. And is it likely that your poor little tenants have liability insurance? Well, maybe not. If you require them to have it, then yes, luckily they have it. But if not, you go where the money is. And 9 times out of 10, the money's not with your tenants, it's with the property owner. So it's a good thing to require them to have that insurance. Okay, what kind of deductibles should you have? Well, that depends on how much you can afford to pay out at any given time. Again, if you're someone that does not keep a lot of cash reserves on hand, which you should, by the way, if you own a bunch of property, but in the event that you don't, what kind of deductible can you afford to pay out at any given time? Because the higher the deductible, the lower your premiums are. But the downside to that is that if there's a claim, and you have to pay $2,000 as a deductible out of pocket, that's $2,000 that you could be doing something else with. So you want to think carefully about how much you can afford at any one time. What if you have a vacant property? So a vacant property actually You see this a lot, especially with people that live out of state and have invested in other places. You can't think that just because it's vacant, there's no tenants in it, that there's nothing you need to do. You're still under an obligation to keep that property safe and free of hazards. And sometimes the fact that you're not there makes it more likely for that property to be targeted, either by people doing illegal or illicit things on the property, or in the event that, they need to find someone to sue, that could be a better target than, the little old lady down the street. So it's a vacant property. You still need to make any kind of steps necessary to secure the property and make sure that you have proper coverage in place. So most of the time that's going to be some kind of a hazard policy. It'll protect you if somebody gets into the property and injures themselves. Even if they're trespassing, doesn't mean they're not going to sue you. And whether you win or not depends on, where the lawsuit's located. But in Philadelphia, that's still not going to stop anyone, and it's not going to stop a jury from awarding a verdict with a bunch of money either. So, really think about that. Think about securing your property, making it safe, having the proper coverage in place. And finally, I do conduct insurance reviews for people. I tend to do them on a flat fee. We look at everything. How do you have the property titled? Whose name is on the deed? What kind of coverage are you carrying? Who are your tenants? Is this enough coverage for the area you're in and the risks you're facing? So if you have any kind of a burning insurance question right now and you want to get on a 15-minute call with me to get your one burning question answered, I can't give you legal advice specific to your situation without you being a client, but I can give you knowledge and information just like I've done on this webinar. I'm happy to do that. I've just opened up 5 slots in my calendar for you to book a 15-minute call with me to have this discussion or question answered. So there should be a link that pops up here where you can book that with me. If you're not able to do that by the link, you can call my office, 215-482-0285. You can email me at info@phillysmallbusinesslawyer.com. Just make sure that you tell the office or say in the email that this is coming from the insurance real estate webinar, so I know how to track the 5 people to respond to this. And I'm happy to answer any of the questions. So I hope that this gave you some information today to be able to take to your insurance agent, your insurance broker, or an attorney, and you have a greater understanding of what kinds of coverage would really benefit you in owning and investing in real estate. Thank you.